Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today we're discussing Federal Farmer number 13, the last in these series of anti-federalist observations from the Federalist Farmer, an anonymous author. So, this paper starts out with a lengthy run-on sentence that outlines all of the many, many things the Federal Farmer does not love about the United States Constitution. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into those right now because I've made 12 other videos going through those, so feel free after this to go back through that catalog. But suffice to say that the Federal Farmer is not happy just running through what he already said. He's got a few more things to add. So a big chunk of this paper is about military force and the militia. Now, this does repeat a lot of what has already been said, but he does come to the conclusion at the end regarding the militia that the militia is run by the people more than any form of regulars or general soldiers in a federal army could be run by the people. They could be controlled by the people. Because of this, he feels the militia, as many did at the time, was a lot more important to the safety of the people because they controlled it. Now, it's very interesting reading through these anti-federalist papers. You don't actually hear that many arguments about the right to bear arms, although, as with the rest of the Bills of Rights, the anti-federalist writers are the ones who really stimulate the Second Amendment as well as the rest of the first 10 amendments. So, it's interesting for him to essentially say this. He doesn't outright use the phrase bear arms, but he does say that it's extremely important for the people to be able to own weapons and use them. He goes as far as to say that, like, children should be taught how to use weapons as soon as they're ready for their own safety. I'm not going to go too deep into that because, again, it is kind of repetitive from prior sources. You see this in the later Federal Farmer papers. There's a lot of repetition of what we already said because it is kind of a money grab, but don't throw it off because there are some really important parts. And in this paper, one of the most important parts of all the federal farmers is discussed, and that is federal districts. Now, he acknowledges that the reason a federal district, aka what would become Washington, D.C., federal districts were seen as needed by the authors of the Constitution because many of them were there in Philadelphia in 1783 when the Pennsylvania line mutinied and almost, attacked them. Luckily, Alexander Hamilton used his renown as a soldier and a general to hold that off, or not a general, a colonel at that point. Forgive me. Either way, the Constitution provides for a federal district. Now, the Federal Farmer says, wait a second, it says you need a 10 mile by 10 mile district. That's a lot of miles. In fact, that's 4 times as large as the city of London. And the city of London at the time was by far the biggest city in the English-speaking world, one of the biggest, I believe the biggest in Europe, and one of the biggest in the entire world. So that's a lot of territory. Additionally, the federal government is in charge of any forts or ports or anything of the like that's related to military that might be ceded from a state to the federal government. Now, the fear here is that while the Constitution permits the states to do most of the day-to-day governing of the people, federal districts and territories are entirely outside of any state jurisdiction. And the Constitution doesn't put any limits on what the federal government's power is in federal districts or territories. So in this big new city they're building, the federal government can do whatever it wants. The president can be an absolute tyrant. Doesn't matter. There is nothing stopping that from happening. Now, the Federal Farmer is even more nervous about this because taking forts, he actually mentions West Point, and he says, what if we need West Point to be 10 miles by 10 miles? Okay, well, then we're going to have a whole lot of New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts are suddenly federal territory. And he's even more afraid on the same note for ports. Many ports are going to be important if you want a navy, which I will say the Federal Farmer does admit that a navy should be run by the Confederated government. However, if there are ports that are taken over by the federal government that are totally under federal jurisdiction, well, there's a few things that can happen. First of all, the people living next to these ports who are paying state and federal taxes might be a little bit easy to cajole over and say, hey, if you cede your property into our federal district, well, then you only have to pay federal taxes. That'll save you some money. And he sees it as an opportunity for very quick talking politicians to be able to rein people in and convince them that it would be better for them to live in these federal districts without the people really considering that they would no longer be within their state, and therefore the federal government will have power over larger and larger swaths of the United States with absolutely no oversight from the states themselves, and really no rule, regulation, or limit as to the power they can impose on these territories and districts. It's one of the few places I've heard so far, because we're going to keep reading these papers, but one of the few anti-federalists that I've really heard make this argument. It's a fascinating one that I never considered myself. I hope you find it fascinating too. If you do, do me a favor and hit like so more people come learn about the revolution with us. And if you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos about the American Revolution 7 days a week. I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.